All right, let's jump right in. Today we're looking at, well, I guess you could say the big question mark hanging over Ukraine. Can they actually find a way out of this war? You all sent in a ton of articles on this, and it's amazing. We've got viewpoints from like everywhere. Ukrainian officials, Western think tanks, even some stuff from Japan.
Yeah, it's definitely a situation the whole world is watching. And with a new U.S. president about to step in, the stakes just got even higher.
Exactly. So I think the big thing we're trying to unpack here is, can Ukraine really pull off a decisive win? Can they get those lost territories back? Or is Zelensky kind of chasing a dream there? What are the chances for peace, really? And how much power does this new U.S. president actually have to change things?
Huge questions. And some of the articles, especially the ones from Ukrainian officials, really highlight how Zelensky sees this whole thing. He's convinced that Ukraine needs more time. They need more military support from the West, get into a stronger position before they even think about sitting down with Russia.
Right, because his argument is if they go into negotiations looking weak, Putin's just going to walk all over them.
Exactly. And he's saying that would be a disaster, not just for Ukraine, but for the West as a whole. Which, looking back at some of the historical stuff about Ukraine's fight for independence, kind of makes sense. They see this as a fight for their very survival as a nation.
Yeah, that's a powerful point. But, it also brings up another question. What does a strong position even look like here? Is it realistic to think they can take back everything they've lost? Especially when you consider those articles that break down the military situation.
Yeah, the balance of power. Some of those Western think tanks they're pretty skeptical. They point out the huge difference in military strength between Russia and Ukraine. Even with all the help the West has been sending, it's still a David and Goliath situation in a lot of ways.
So if a clear victory is unlikely, where does that leave Zelensky? Is he gambling with the future of Ukraine by waiting for something that might never happen?
And that's where things get even trickier when you factor in the new U.S. president. Trump has been totally upfront about wanting this war to end fast. He's pledged to get a peace deal in his first 100 days.
Wow, that's ambitious.
It is. And you sent in some really interesting pieces that shed light on his thinking. One even mentioned that Trump might see this as his ticket to a Nobel Peace Prize, which might actually explain some of his moves. But anyway, back to Zelensky.
Yeah, it's a tough spot. If Zelensky wants to keep building up Ukraine's military before talking, but Trump wants a quick peace deal, those two things just don't line up, do they? Could this create some serious tension between them?
Oh, absolutely. And what's interesting? You send in this analysis from a Japanese think tank, and they actually dive deep into the exact dynamic. They're saying Trump's whole deal maker approach to foreign policy could backfire here. He might end up pushing Zelensky into some agreement that hurts Ukraine in the long run just to get a win for himself.
Wow. That's kind of cynical, but it makes you think.
Right. And this is where things get even more tangled. This Japanese think tank also suggests that Japan's own worries about China are playing a role here. They're thinking if they help Ukraine stand up to Russia, it might kind of keep China in check too. It's like global power struggles playing out right there in Ukraine.
It's crazy how interconnected everything is. But let's talk about something a little more concrete. What about those long-range strikes Ukraine's been launching? Hitting targets way inside Russia, oil facilities, factories, even military bases. That feels like a major escalation to me.
Yeah, it definitely shows they're switching up their tactics. But whether it's actually working, that's a whole other debate. The articles you sent paint kind of different pictures. On the one hand, yeah, they're hitting Russia's economy, no doubt about it. But then some of the analysts point out that Russia's been surprisingly good at bouncing back. They fix the damage pretty quickly.
So resilient.
Right. And one article actually breaks down the cost of all these repairs, and they're saying Russia can handle it, at least for now.
So even though these strikes are putting the squeeze on Russia, it's not a guarantee that Putin will be like, all right, let's talk. Especially when you consider that stat from one of the articles. 46% of their oil refineries are now within range of Ukrainian weapons. That's a huge chunk of their economy hanging in the balance.
It is, but it also shows you just how risky this strategy is. The more Ukraine hits targets inside Russia, the more likely Putin is to lash out, really hard.
And then there's the whole issue of Western military aid. Is it actually helping bring peace closer, or is it making things drag on even longer? That seems to be a pretty heated debate right now.
For sure. And that article featuring General Kellogg, that's a perfect example. He's basically saying that all this focus on weapons is keeping the war going, making a bigger war even more likely. And he thinks everyone's forgetting about diplomacy, finding a peaceful solution.
Makes sense. But then you've got the other side, especially those articles from Ukrainian officials. They're saying, hey, this Western aid is keeping us alive. We need it. They point to the fact that Ukraine's now producing a ton of their own drones and that the US and the UK are letting them use their missiles to hit targets inside Russia. So the West is definitely getting more involved, but it's also getting blurrier. Like, where does support end and direct involvement begin?
Yeah, it's a really delicate balance. And with this new U.S. administration that wants a quick fix, who knows how that balance will shift?
So, taking all of this into account, what are the real options for peace here?
Well, let's explore that next.
Okay, so we've talked about the challenges, the different viewpoints, and the pressures Zelensky's facing. But what are the actual paths to peace here? What are the options people are talking about in these articles you sent?
Well, we've already touched on one, negotiations. But like we've seen, that's a lot harder than it sounds. Your sources point out some pretty huge roadblocks. Like, first of all, you've got this deep mistrust between Russia and Ukraine. Years of fighting, broken promises. It's hard to imagine them actually finding common ground, especially when you're talking about, giving up territory.
Yeah, that seems to be the sticking point, right? Can you really see Russia just walking away from Crimea, from the Donbass? I mean, that's a major industrial hub for them. It's vital to their economy. And on the flip side, would Ukraine ever accept anything less than getting all their land back?
Probably not. And even if they somehow miraculously agreed on those big issues, how do you make sure they both actually stick to the deal? Which brings us to that second option, the ceasefire with peacekeepers.
Yeah, that sounds like a massive headache waiting to happen. You're talking about sending a ton of troops into a super volatile region, maybe for years. Who's going to volunteer for that? And would Russia and Ukraine even trust them to be neutral?
Exactly. One of the reports you sent, it's from a European security think tank. They really get into the nitty-gritty of peacekeeping. And their argument is, if you don't have a solid political agreement first, those peacekeepers basically become a human shield between two enemies, constantly at risk of getting sucked into the fighting.
So, not really a long-term solution. And what about that wild card? Ukraine joining NATO. We talked about it earlier, but does anyone really think that could happen? I mean, Russia hates the idea, and even some NATO countries aren't too keen on it.
Yeah, that's a no-go, at least for now. That Japanese think tank we mentioned, they basically say NATO membership for Ukraine is off the table. It would be seen as like an existential threat by Russia, could even spark a much bigger conflict. And some of those NATO countries that share a border with Russia, they're understandably nervous about poking the bear.
So negotiations are stalled, peacekeeping is tricky, and NATO is out of the question. What's left for Ukraine? It kind of feels like they're running out of options.
It's a tough situation, and one that Zelensky really needs to face head on. Some of the articles you sent actually suggest that his whole victory at all costs stance might actually be hurting Ukraine in the long run. They're saying by refusing to even consider real peace talks, he could end up pushing away his allies in the West, especially with this new U.S. president who's all about ending this thing quickly.
Right, because that UK think tank really drove that point home. They're saying Zelensky needs to be more, realistic. He needs to understand that some kind of negotiated settlement, even if it means making tough compromises, might be the only way to stop Ukraine from getting even more destroyed or even broken apart completely.
And that ties into the bigger question of, what even happens to Ukraine. One article, it's by a Ukrainian academic, paints a pretty grim picture. They're arguing that if Zelensky keeps refusing to negotiate, the most likely outcome is this long, drawn-out war that ends with Russia taking over parts of Ukraine and the rest left trying to pick up the pieces.
So after all this, what's the takeaway for our listeners? What should they be thinking about after diving into all this with us?
The sources you've shared, they really highlight the danger of, false hope. And they show how important it is to have leaders who are pragmatic. Zelensky's vision of total victory, it's powerful, it's inspiring, but it just doesn't match up with the reality on the ground.
And holding on to that vision too tightly, it might actually lead to the worst possible outcome for Ukraine. They could lose even more territory, their economy could be shattered, the country could even fall apart. It's a harsh reminder that sometimes, even when you're fighting against aggression, compromise might be the best or at least bad option.
Yeah, I think you've summed it up really well. This whole deep dive has shown us just how difficult and uncertain the road to peace in Ukraine is going to be. It's going to take tough choices, leaders who can make those hard decisions, and a clear-eyed understanding of the risks.
It reminds us that even in the darkest times, hope needs to be balanced with realism. Hopefully, this deep dive has given everyone a good starting point for understanding what Ukraine's facing.
But this is just the beginning, really. Keep exploring, keep asking those tough questions, keep learning. The future of Ukraine, and really the whole world order, depends on people like you engaging with these issues.
And who knows, maybe you'll stumble across some amazing new research or a totally different way of looking at things that could shed light on this whole situation. If you do, send it our way. We'd love to dive into it with you.
Until next time, keep those minds working.
That's all for this deep dive. Thanks for listening.